This morning we're turning to the Old Testament, to the book of Esther, please. The book of Esther, chapter 3. I'm going to read the first 11 verses of Esther chapter 3, and then I'm also going to read the first 3 verses of chapter 4. What is the message of the book of Esther? Esther chapter 3 and verse 1. After these things did King Ahasuerus promote Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him and set his seat above all the princes that were with him. And all the king's servants that were in the king's gate or his court bowed and reverenced Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai bowed not, nor did him reverence. Then the king's servants which were in the king's gate or court said unto Mordecai, Why transgressest thou the king's commandment? Now it came to pass, when they spake daily unto him, and he hearkened not unto them, that they told Haman to see whether Mordecai's matters would stand. For he had told them that he was a Jew. And when Haman saw that Mordecai bowed not, nor did him reverence, then was Haman full of wrath. And he thought scorn to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had showed him the people of Mordecai, wherefore Haman sought to destroy all the Jews throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, even the people of Mordecai. In the first month, that is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast pur, that is the lot, before Haman, from day to day and from month to month, to the 12th month, that is the month of Adar. And Haman said unto King Ahasuerus, There is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the people of the provinces of thy kingdom, and their laws are diverse or different from all people, neither keep they the king's laws. Therefore it is not for the king's profit to suffer them. If it please the king, let it be written that they may be destroyed. And I will pay 10,000 talents of silver to the hands of those that have charge of the business, to bring it into the king's treasury. And the king took his ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the Jews' enemy. And the king said unto Haman, The silver is given unto thee, and the people also do unto them as seemeth good unto thee. You skip down a little bit to the next chapter, chapter 4, in the first 3 verses. What's Mordecai's reaction to all this? When Mordecai perceived all that was done, Mordecai rent his clothes and put on sackcloth with ashes, and went out into the midst of the city and cried with a loud and bitter cry, and came before the king's gate, for none might enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. And in every province whitherso the king's command and decrees came, there was a great mourning among the Jews, and fasting and weeping and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. Amen, and the Lord will bless the reading of his inspired word to us. This morning, I want to tell you a story from the Bible. It's the story of the book of Esther. Many years ago, someone asked me to do a sermon on the book of Esther, the whole book, one sermon. But the story of the book of Esther is absolutely marvelous. God is not mentioned. Yet his fingerprints, his providence in controlling every situation is seen so clearly. Number one, the background. Every story has a context, doesn't it? The background. The time. What time did these events happen? These events happened between the year 485 and 465 BC. It's good in your minds to have a timeline of the Bible. Creation 4004 BC. Abraham 2000 BC. Moses 1500. King David 1000 BC. Solomon just after him, around about 900s. Isaiah 700 BC. The northern kingdom of Israel was exiled destroyed into Assyria in 722 BC. And the Babylonian exile happened in 598 BC. After 70 years, they returned to the land, or some of them did. Now, in the years I've given you, 485 to 465 BC, many of the Jews have now returned from the exile in Babylon. They have returned about 20 to 30 years ago. Ezra has already rebuilt the temple of God in Jerusalem. It was built in 515 BC. The events of the book of Esther take place between chapters 6 and 7 in the book of Ezra. 20 years after the temple has rebuilt, but still many of the Jews, the majority of the Jews, remain in what is now called the Persian Empire, because the Persian Empire took over the Babylonian Empire. Not many of the Jews really came home, back to Jerusalem. The place, that's the time, okay? The place that these events take place is the Persian Empire. For a few generations, for 70 years, many of the Jews were born in Persia. They had homes there. They had jobs there. They had their children there. 70 years is a long time. The Persian Empire was their home. And many of them did not want to go back to Jerusalem, to a country that had virtually no borders and a faltering economy, and all the hard work of rebuilding Jerusalem and the constant threat of enemy attack. They were an accepted part of the Persian Empire, which at the time was the world's superpower, like America is today. Can you imagine folks living in America and then wanting to leave America to go to somewhere really poor where there's lots of trouble and living in mud huts? Not many would want to do it, sure they wouldn't. Well, it was the same with the Jews living in Persia. Many of them didn't want to go back to Jerusalem. And the events in the book of Esther take place in the city of Susa. That's in modern day Iran, and it's one of the 3 capital cities of the Persian Empire. The king of Persia went to the city of Susa in the winter. It was his winter palace. The citadel, or the palace, according to Esther chapter 1 and verse 5, was an acropolis, or a fortified castle, that stood 120 feet above the rest of the city. It was on a plateau and it overlooked the rest of the city of Susa. And if you want to know where Susa is on a map, it's gone now, of course, but if you go to the tip of the Persian Gulf, and then you go northwest, which is left and up a bit, 100 miles inland, that's exactly where the city of Susa was. The Persian Empire is vast. 127 provinces or countries. Each province was ruled by its own ruler or satrap, a king, under the emperor, as it were. The provinces of Persia stretched from India all the way to Ethiopia. And the king of Persia is the absolute monarch. The people involved in the story. The main people are these. King Ahasuerus. Another name for him is Xerxes. Many of the kings have many names in the Old Testament. King Ahasuerus or Xerxes reigned from 485 to 465 BC, and he is described by history books as a reckless, cruel, capricious man. Ruthless. It was King Xerxes or Ahasuerus that led the war against the Greeks. And you've all no doubt heard of the 300 Spartans at the Battle of Thermopylae. That was against King Xerxes. King Ahasuerus here in the book of Esther. He led the Persian army. That's the first person, King Ahasuerus or Xerxes. The second person I want to introduce to you in the story is Haman. Haman is a cruel man who is promoted by the king to be prime minister of the whole empire, the second most powerful man in the empire. And the Bible tells us in chapter 3 and verse 1, he was an Agite. He was someone connected with Agag, king of the Amalekites. That means the arch enemies of the Jews, Israel. And then another person in the story is Esther, a Jewish girl, a young girl who'd lost both her parents. And Mordecai, her cousin, who looked after Esther as if she was his own daughter. It tells you that in chapter 2, verse 7. Esther is a young girl who is startlingly beautiful, and she is to become the queen of Persia in 479 BC. Although it was not, of course, through her own choice. And then Mordecai, we're going to look at him in the next point. But there's the few of the people. I've given you the time, the place where the events occur, and the people, the king, the prime minister, and Esther, the Jewess. Let me come to the second main point. The man Mordecai. What do we know about him? We know he's a believing Jew and a good job. He worked in the palace, the citadel, 120 feet above the city. He worked in the king's gate, it says, which means the king's court. We often find him in the king's court. Chapter 2, verse 21, chapter 3, verse 2, chapter 5, verse 9, chapter 13, verses 6 to 10 and 12. The ESV Study Bible says he's a Persian official. He works in the government, Mordecai. He had a high-power job. We know also about this man that he was kind and caring. Well, where do you get that, you might say? You get it from chapter 2, verses 6 and 7. He took young Esther under his care, and he looked after her. And when she was taken to the palace Hiram, Mordecai tells us in chapter 2, verse 11, he went and he visited her every day. If someone visits you every day, you know they care about you, don't you? Every day he visited her. So he's obviously a kind and caring man. But not only that, he's honest and he's just. He's not a rebel, because it tells us in chapter 2, verse 21 to 23, that there's two men called Bigthan and Teresh, who were the king's guards, and they guarded the threshold, the Bible says, which means they were the guards of the door to the throne room of the king. But these two men planned to assassinate King Ahasuerus or Xerxes, and Esther found out, and she told Mordecai, and Mordecai found out, told Esther, and Esther told the king, and the two guards were executed. And this event, and it's important to note this, was recorded, according to chapter 2, verse 23, was recorded in the Chronicles of the King. See, everything that happened in the king's life, they wrote it down in volume after volume of a book, which was the history of the king. So this event of Mordecai exposing assassination attempt on the king is recorded in one of those volumes. Remember that for later. What else do we know about this man? We know that he's a man of prayer, and he encouraged other people to pray. Chapter 4, verse 1, he comes in sackcloth and ashes, fasting and praying together for all the Jews. We know also that he's a man of his word. He refused to bow down to Haman in the king's court. Everyone else bowed down. He didn't. He was like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, wasn't he? He said he wasn't going to bow down when the guards questioned him, and he didn't. He stuck to what he said. He didn't do what he said he wasn't going to do. He was a man of his word. His word was his bond. And his word was a witness, because when the guards questioned him and he said, I'm not going to bow, for I'm a Jew, then the guards went and told Haman. And it says in the verse, to see whether Mordecai's words would stand, to see whether he'd do what he said, to see whether he's honest. And he did do what he said, because he was honest. He still didn't bow, no matter what pressure they put on him. So that's Mordecai the person. Faithful Persian official. Kind and caring, honest and just, a man of prayer, and a man of his word. Now let's come to the story. Point number 3, the problem. It says in chapter 3 and verse 5 and 6, when Haman saw that Mordecai bowed not, nor did him reverence, then was Haman full of wrath. And he thought scorn to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had showed him the people of Mordecai, wherefore Haman sought to destroy all the Jews that were throughout the whole kingdom. The evil prime minister, in his fury, his hatred, and his human pride, decides that it's not enough just to punish the one man who won't bow, but he wants to exterminate the whole people of Mordecai. Mass genocide. That's what this verse is talking about. Stalin and Hitler were not the first nor the last to want mass genocide. It's happened over and over again in all of history. Haman was evil. He wants to kill millions of people. He approaches the king and tells the king in his sly, sneaky way, you know, there's a people in your kingdom and they don't obey your rules and they don't quite fit in, and you'd be better off without them. You would be of more profit, is the word he uses, if you didn't have them. And he goes on and he says, I will put 10,000 talents of silver into your personal treasury if you give me permission to wipe out all the Jews. You know how much money that is? The annual income for the whole Persian Empire in these years, in 1 year, the annual income for a year was about 15,000 talents of silver. The whole empire. Haman is saying to the king, I'm going to pay you a massive bribe of 2/3 of the annual revenue of the whole empire. Imagine if somebody said to you, whatever the annual revenue of the United States of America is, billions and billions, I'll give you 2/3 of it. See how big the bribe is? That's what Haman does. And he put it into the king's treasury. And the king says, okay. Gives him a signet ring, stamps the wax, and the deal is done. The problem in this story is basically this: an evil man in power passing evil legislation against the people of God. Now you could apply that, couldn't you? Evil people in power passing evil legislation against God's people. And that's what Haman did in the corridors of power. So I've set the scene for you. The background, the man Mordecai, and the problem. What happened? Here's what happened. And here's where you see God's hand in every single event. In the time when an evil politician was passing wicked legislation against God's people, Mordecai, the man of God, the first thing he did is he wept and he prayed and he fasted for God's people. And he encouraged God's people to do the same. That's the first thing he did. When evil men pass wicked legislation against God's people, the first thing to do is pray earnestly. But it starts there, but it doesn't stop there. Sure it doesn't. Then the man of God, Mordecai, challenged the woman of God, Esther, in the place of power, the queen, to make a stand for God's people at this time. It says that in chapter 4, verses 6 to 8, doesn't it? He challenges her. He charges her to make supplication, go into the king's throne room and make supplication to him. Now Esther sends a message back in chapter 4. And she says basically this: I can't go into the throne room of King Ahasuerus uninvited. Because the law is, and this was the law of this nation, okay? The law of the country. The law is, whoever enters the throne room of the king uninvited is to be put to death. It's the death penalty. Unless, when that person goes in, the king holds out his golden scepter and that person touches the end of the golden scepter, then their life is spared. But generally that didn't happen. Esther's saying, if I go into the throne room uninvited, the law says my penalty is death. And she says, I haven't been invited into the throne room for 30 days. That's verses 10 and 12 of chapter 4. Everything I'm saying to you is right here in the text. And this reply from Queen Esther prompts one of the most prominent classic texts in the whole of the Old Testament. Listen to what Mordecai says in verse 13 and 14. Then Mordecai commanded to answer Esther, think not with thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all the Jews. For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall enlargement or deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall perish or be destroyed. And then he says this, and who knowest whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Who knows whether it's not that God has placed you right in that exact position at this time just for this very thing? Queen Esther, he says, don't hold your peace at this time when wicked men are passing evil legislation against God's people. You're in the position of power. Don't hold your peace. You see how Mordecai also trusts in God's providence? Because he says in verse 14, if you don't deliver God's people, deliverance will come in another way. But you and your father's house will perish as well, because you're a Jew. If you don't stand, God will deliver his people anyway. Queen Esther, he says, now is the time to make a stand for the people of God. And he says to her, but surely it may be that God has brought you into the kingdom just for this very thing. You know what he's saying? He's saying, my cousin, my queen, could it be God has placed you here just for the very purpose of using your influence to save God's people? And then what happened? The woman of God, in the place of political power, says, yes, I will stand. Fast and pray for 3 days, and I will stand. Chapter 4, verses 15 to 17. Esther bade them return to Mordecai, go and gather the Jews that are present in Shushan or Susa, fast for me, don't eat or drink for 3 days, and I will go in. And she says at the end of verse 16, and if I perish, I perish. Note what it also says there, it's worth noting. Verse 16, the last half. I go into the king, which is not according to the law, which is breaking the law of the land. And if I perish, I perish. And that's what happened. God's people fasted and wept for 3 days. Then Queen Esther went in before the king. And the king held out the golden scepter to her. And within 2 days, God had overruled the world superpower of Persia and turned the whole situation around for the good of God's people. But it's better if I tell you it in story form, isn't it? Here's how it happened. The queen went into the throne room, the king spared her life, and he said, Queen Esther, what do you want? The queen says, I want you and the Prime Minister Haman to come to my apartments for a feast tomorrow. And the king said yes. And that next day, the king and the Prime Minister, full of pride, they came, just the two guests, to a feast in the queen's apartments. And the king says to his queen, what do you want, Queen Esther? And Esther says, come again tomorrow and I'll tell you. So off they go, and they're going to come again tomorrow. And wicked Haman, the Prime Minister, who bribed the king to kill all the Jews, he goes home, and you read this in the passage, full of pride, and he boasts to his servants and his wife how only he and the king are invited to another feast with the queen tomorrow. But he says, it's all worth nothing as long as I see that Jew Mordecai not bowing every time I come through the door. I want him dead. And his advisors advise him, why don't, chapter 5, verses 11 to 14, why don't you build a gallows for hanging Mordecai on? Build a gallows 50 cubits high. You know how high that is? 75 feet. Way higher than the roof of your church. Almost double it. Massive gallows to hang the man of God on. Build the gallows 75 feet high and go into the king early tomorrow morning into his outer room where he takes petitions before the feast and ask the king to hang Mordecai, the Jew, on the gallows. And Haman liked that plan. And that's what he did. So it's all plotted by the evil man. The plan is set. Mordecai will be dead. The Jew will be dead. The man of God will be dead before the feast when Queen Esther will make the petition. However, in God's providence, you know what happened that night? That night of all nights, the king can't sleep. Think that's chance? No such thing. The king can't sleep. And what does he do when he can't sleep? He calls in a servant to read to him a history book. History's great for that, you know. See, if you can't sleep, read a history book. And out of all the volumes of the history of the king, out of them all, the servant picks a particular volume. And out of that volume, he picks an exact page and reads the account of Mordecai, the man of God, exposing the assassination attempt on the king. Providence. And the king says to his servant who's reading the book, what reward was given to Mordecai the Jew? And the servant says, he was never rewarded. And the king says to his servant, "Who's in my outer court now?" Early in the morning. Who was there? Haman, the evil prime minister, who's come to ask to kill Mordecai, the man of God. And the king says, "Bring the prime minister in." And before Haman can say, "Can I kill the man of God?" the king says to his prime minister, "What honor should be done for the man that the king wants to honor?" What honor? And the prime minister, Haman, he of course thinks in his pride that the king's talking about him. And Haman says, chapter 6, verse 6, "You should put a royal crown on the man's head. You should clothe the man in a royal robe. You should set that man on the king's horse and have an important dignitary lead the horse round the whole city of Susa, declaring, 'This is the man that the king wants to honor.'" And the king says, "That's good. I want you to go and do that for Mordecai the Jew." The man he wants to kill. And in his pride, he is greatly humbled, and he has to put the crown on the man he hates, the man of God's head. He has to robe the Mordecai in the king's robe. He has to put Mordecai on the king's horse, and he has to lead him round the city of Susa, shouting, "This is the man that the king wants to honor." Totally humiliated. Do you think any of that all just exactly happened at the right moment by chance? Not a bit of it. That is called the providence of God. But it's not over yet. Wicked Haman has been humiliated. Home he goes. And just as he goes home, he's so fed up now, he's humiliated. The king's servants arrive in the carriage to take him to the feast with the queen and the king. He doesn't feel like going, but he has to go. And it gets worse. At the feast of wine, it says in chapter 7 and verse 4, the queen tells her husband, the king, that she's a Jew. And she says, "Me and my people have been condemned to death by someone in your government." Chapter 7, verse 4. And the king in anger says, "Who has dared to do this?" And the queen looks across the table and points at the prime minister and says, "Him." I'm sure he near choked in his wine. The Bible tells us in chapter 7, verse 7, the king rose in fury, opened the doors and went out into the palace garden to think, to clear his head. What's he going to do? And Haman, that tells us in chapter 7, verse 8, Haman stays to beg for his life off the queen. And then, as he's going to beg for his life with the queen, at the very moment the king comes back from the garden in through the door, and somehow at that very moment, maybe it was on a rug or something, Haman trips and actually falls on top of the queen. And the king sees that and thinks that Haman's attacking his queen and brings the guards in, and the Bible just says they cover his face and he's led out. And the king hears of the gallows 75 feet high, prepared for the man of God. And the king commands that the wicked man is hung on the gallows that he made. And that's exactly what happens. God's providence in times and events. God worked Haman's evil plan for the good of his people. Or, as it says in Psalm number 7, he made a pit and digged it, and he that digged it is fallen in there himself. His mischief shall return upon his own head, and his violent dealings shall come up down upon his own pate, his own forehead. What he planned to do evil to others was exactly what was done to him. It says, by the way, in Psalm 7, that's what God does to the wicked. This is the God I worship. And he's the same today. He's the one that changes not. What's the message of the book of Esther? It's very, very simple, isn't it? God delivers his people, but he delivers his people through means, through others that obey him. He delivers his people through Mordecai, the man of God. He delivers his people through the queen, the people of God in places of power. He delivers his people through fervent prayer of his people. That's how he delivers them from evil legislation. And the message is this: it's when the man of God challenges the people of God in places of authority to make a stand for what's right. And God's places and people of authority do make a stand for what's right, even if it's against civil law. That's taught over and over again in Acts as well. And when God's people fervently pray, it is then that God turns evil legislation round for the good of his people. When the man of God challenges the woman of God in position of power to make a stand for what's right, and at the same time God's people are praying, then God turns evil legislation right around for the good of the church. The application's obvious, isn't it? In the United Kingdom, I ask you, in Northern Ireland, where are the special men of God that are challenging those in positions of power? I don't know any. And are God's people in positions of power making a stand for biblical truth? Most are certainly not. They go along with civil partnerships, they go along with abortion, they go along with everything as long as it lines their pockets. It's when the man of God challenges the people of God in positions of authority to make a stand, and when they make a stand for what's right, and at the same time God's people are weeping and praying, it is then that God turns evil legislation around for the good of his people. But if these things are not happening, it's no wonder that evil legislation remains, is not changed, but indeed is accepted by Christians, in inverted commas, in positions of power. No wonder that's happening. No wonder. But make no mistake, God will deliver his people. He will. Mordecai said to Esther, if not by you, he'll do it some other way. He always delivers his people. And I'd love to say that to Christian politicians in Stormont. If it's not through you making a stand that God will deliver his people, deliverance will come another way. But you and your father's house will perish for not making a stand for biblical truth. Christians, in this situation that we're in, could it not be? You know, I often, when I first became a Christian when I was 17, that was the year 1987, since then reading books and all, I've often wished, I wish I lived in the 1600s, you know, the days of the Puritans. I wish I lived in the 1700s under Whitefield and Wesley, when the church and the great revival was going on and the church was strong. Or even in the 1850s, the 1890s, when Spurgeon was preaching, when the church was strong. But if I don't want to work, I was brought up in Lisburn Congregational Church. We had 300 people there, 90 at the prayer meeting. Today you wouldn't even have 90 at the Sunday services, and the prayer meetings less than 20. These days when churches are dying, I always wished I lived in some other time when the church was growing. And then I read the Bible and read that this, could it be that God has brought you to the kingdom just for such a time as this? God has us here now at this time for some purpose, for to do his will how we can. And he's brought us here at this time. And if you're here this morning and you're not saved, let me say this to you. The God of the Bible works all things after the counsel of his own will and for the good of Christians. And God, Jehovah, overrules world powers. And that God would save you from your sin. But you must bow the knee, admit you're a sinner, and come to God accepting the sacrifice of Jesus Christ dying in your place for your sins, turning from your sins and trusting in him. And he would save you and make you a man or woman of God. And then you would see his providence in all these things in your life. God overrules world superpowers, doesn't he? He puts people in positions in order that they would stand. He expects his Christians to pray and weep. Are we doing these things? Let us do these things. Could it be that we are brought to the kingdom for such a time as this? Of course it is. Thank you for your attention, and God bless you.